Thank you, Eitan, and thank you everyone for coming. There is a verse in the book of Daniel that I find very troubling. I'm sure most of you have had sleepless nights over the book of Daniel, pretty much like me. The story of Daniel takes place after the destruction of the first temple, and the Jews had been brought to Babylonia as captives during the Babylonian exile. In the first chapter of the book, the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, tells his chief officer to bring a few young Israelite men to serve in his palace, and one of them is Daniel. In this first chapter, it's verse 7 that I find troubling. Read the following. Vayasem lahem sara sarsim shemot, vayasem leDaniel Belteshazzar. The chief officer gave them new names, and I'll insert my own free translation. Daniel was saddled with Belteshazzar. How dare the Babylonians rename Daniel? What's wrong with the name Daniel? And the text itself actually hints at Daniel's rejection of this new name, because he's called Belteshazzar 9 times in the book, but each time it's either by the king or the narrator. Daniel only ever calls himself Daniel. What gives someone the right to impose a name on someone else? Of course, you might ask, why am I so bothered by this issue? So what if Daniel is given a new name? See, the problem is, names, they're not just titles. They often symbolize identity. I think embodying the characteristics that we see in ourselves and how we would like to be perceived by other people. And not only that, names can hold meaning for us in many different ways. They can be a link to our ancestors, to our heritage, like being named after a significant grandparent. They can help to define who we are in the now, especially if we change our names or we assume a new title. And they can connect us to the future, as when we try to live up to a name, or we want to make a name for ourselves that will live on in future generations. So we see that hidden inside the name are links to the past, present, and future of each person's identity. The Torah also shows us the importance of names by expressly informing us who names whom. God names some of the biblical characters, as when God renames Abraham, Sarah, and Yaakov. Adam HaRishon, the first human being, names all the animals in the Garden of Eden. Many biblical parents name their children, like Abraham, Leah, Rachel, and even some of the prophets, like Isaiah. And we even see a similar name change to that endured by Daniel in the biblical character Joseph, who was renamed in Egypt by Pharaoh with a name that rivals Belteshazzar, Tzafnat Paneach. How do you think Daniel felt about being renamed? The name Daniel means God is my judge, and it's a very significant part of his self-image. Because in chapter 4, verse 5 of the book, we read that Nebuchadnezzar informs the reader, Daniel was named Belteshazzar, Dishmei Belteshazzar kishum elahi v'diruach elahin kadishin be, after the name of my God, in whom the spirit of the holy gods was. So the two names are in direct opposition to one another. One includes the name of Daniel's God, our God, and the other the name of the pagan god of his captors. I think juxtaposing the two names sheds light on why Daniel clung to his Israelite identity, his name. It was bound up with his heritage. Daniel sees this new name as a symbol of the diaspora, of his oppression under the idolatrous Babylonians. In chapter 9, verse 2, he looks to the sources, to the book of Jeremiah specifically, to seek comfort, to seek hope for the eventual return to Israel. In that verse, Daniel mentions the prophet Jeremiah by name as a way of calling upon his ancestors to give him strength. Now, Jeremiah also had a complicated bond with his name and with his identity, and perhaps Daniel felt a connection with this particular prophet. Jeremiah had kind of a complex love-hate relationship with the role that he had been given. In chapter 1, verse 5, God informs Jeremiah that B'terem etzarecha v'beten yadaticha, u'v'terem teisei merechem hikdashticha. Before I created you in the womb, I selected you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. God chose him while he was still a fetus. What this says to me is that he was given an identity before he had a chance to form his own. His fate was predetermined and he had no say in the matter. Before he was named, God had a relationship with him, so in a way, his relationship with God was not tied to his name. Now I say this because I see his name, Yirmiyahu, as a struggle to free himself from his task and from his fate. In chapter 20, verse 9, Jeremiah tries to end his prophetic career, wanting no longer to be hated and abused, always the bearer of bad news and rebuke. But he cannot stop proclaiming the word of God. Ve'amarti lo ezkerenu ve'lo adaber od bishmo ve'haya ve'libi ke'esh bo'eret atzur ba'atzmotai ve'nileti kalchel ve'lo uchal. I thought, I will not mention him, nor will I speak in his name. But it was like a raging fire in my heart, shut up in my bones. I could not hold it in. I was helpless. Jeremiah's one defiance was his name. Yirmiyahu meaning either God will uplift the soul or God will loosen the bonds. Yet his soul was anything but uplifted. In fact, it was probably quite singed from the fiery words it had to share space with inside Jeremiah. And how Jeremiah longed for the bonds of his prophecy to be loosened and removed. Now, not everyone agrees that he chafed under this heavy burden. I see it as a struggle, though. Yes, he knew what he had to do, and I think he accepted it, but his task and his name were in conflict. Sometimes I think we actually feel the same way. Perhaps for us it's not as dramatic, but we too can find it difficult to live up to these expectations, to always model the behavior that others assume we embody. I mentioned earlier that names can hide within them links to the past, the present, and the future of one's identity. Well, if Daniel's name reminded him of the past, and Jeremiah was, in a sense, his ongoing rebellion in the present, then Sarah's name, in this week's parashah, exemplifies the meaning of a name for future generations. In this week's Torah portion, Chaye Sarah, we see that even though it has the uplifting title, The Life of Sarah, it actually informs us of the death of Sarah. And the theme of death continues in that both Abraham and their son Yishmael die at the end of the very same portion. Chaye Sarah is one of the only parshiot that has the name of a person in its title, and her name is indeed very important. We learned a couple of weeks ago in Lech Lecha that God altered the name from Sarai to Sarah. What does this change represent?